This week we're going to be putting a CG carving onto real footage of a pumpkin, and we're going to be using booleans to do this and also doing some motion tracking in order to tie it into actually moving footage. So the first step here is to capture our footage, and for this you're going to need a camera. I'm using the Canon C200, but you could use anything that gives you manual control over the aperture and focus of your lens really, and you're also going to need a pumpkin. So the first thing we're going to do here is grab a Sharpie and just draw a bunch of crosses on the side of the pumpkin that we're going to be filming. These are going to be used as tracking markers, and you want to draw at least 8 of these on here, as that's the minimum number that Blender needs to do a 3D camera solve. So then we're going to set up a little scene. I just grabbed the kind of spookiest stuff I had lying around with a few fairy lights, and I couldn't be bothered to set up my proper film lights, so I just grabbed some lamps I had floating around, which you can probably tell from the amount of noise in the image. I wanted a nice spooky track in for this shot, so I'm using the Canova K7 camera slider, but theoretically you could pull this off with any kind of camera movement, even if you went completely handheld, but you'd want to be fairly careful not to get too much motion blur in your shot. Once we've got our footage, we're going to turn that into a PNG sequence, as Blender finds that the easiest to load, and in my case I'm shooting in Canon RAW, which isn't a format Blender can read at all. So I'm going to use Premiere Pro to do this, but there's a whole bunch of different ways you can accomplish that, including inside of Blender. So when we open up Blender, as is tradition, we're going to delete the default cube, then hop over to the movie clip editor. From here we're going to load up our image sequence, then bring the start and end frames in to match the length of the clip we want. Then we can press P to prefetch the frames we're using into the RAM, and that makes it easier to work with. We then want to start tracking, so you can control click to add a point. You want to pick the edges of the crosses, somewhere that you can easily distinguish if you need to manually reposition the track later down the line. Once that track's in place, we can press Ctrl T to track it forward, or Shift Ctrl T to track backwards from the other end of the sequence. If the tracker turns red and stops at any point, you can just reposition it and resume tracking. You can also do all this in bulk on multiple trackers at one time. So then we need to plug our camera details into the tracker. So you should be able to look up the exact width of your camera's sensor if it isn't one of the listed presets in Blender. And we also need to plug in the focal length of our lens. So once we've got all our trackers running nicely and they're not jumping all over the place or anything like that, we're going to hit the Solve Camera Motion button. And we're also going to tick the box that lets Blender estimate our keyframes for us. So once that's done, that should give you a solve error value, and you want the lowest value you possibly can here. If you're getting over about 0.5, something's probably wrong and you'll want to adjust your trackers and solve again. Below that, you just kind of have to see whether it's sticking properly in the 3D viewport and tweak the trackers from there. So then you can hit Set as Background and Set Up Tracking Scene. And if we jump back into the viewport, we can see we've got a little scene that's generated. You can delete pretty much everything here, including the collections, apart from the camera. And then we can reset the camera's transforms by hitting Alt-G and Alt-R. In the movie clip editor, you can select 2 tracking points, and then on your actual pumpkin, measure the distance between those points in real life. And then you can plug that value in meters into the distance box and hit Set Scale, and that's now going to scale everything in the scene properly. Back in the viewport, you can enable tracking markers in the overlays menu, and then we can use that to help us position the camera. And you can test your camera positioning by lining a plane up with, in this case, the edge of the table, but basically any object in the scene, and move the camera until when you play back it sticks properly. I'm also going to enable depth of field in the camera menu and set the aperture to what I had it set to when I shot the clip, so it's a good idea to note that down while you're doing it. In this case it was about T2.8. So I'm then going to target the focus object at an empty and place that just about where our plane of focus is in the footage. We're now going to add a sphere that's going to stand in for our pumpkin and scale it so that it's touching the tracking markers roughly. You can hop into edit mode and get it to match our pumpkin a little bit better using proportional editing and scaling and that sort of thing. So initially I thought that it'd be best to go very high poly on this, but it turns out that the Boolean modifier can get a little bit glitchy if you've got too much geometry intersecting, so we're just going to keep this quite low poly. We're then going to duplicate that mesh and put it in a collection that's hidden, and on the visible pumpkin you're going to add a solidifying modifier. Now you can use the X-ray view to check how thick it should be. It's your guess really, how thick you want the pumpkin to appear. We can then duplicate that again and invert the thickness of the solidifying modifier so it's sticking out slightly. I usually set it to about 1 millimeter or so. And we're going to use this second pumpkin to mask off the pumpkin skin so that we're only seeing the kind of cut out part, and that's going to enable us to overlay that back into our footage. So I'm now going to add a plane into a new collection and move it in front of the pumpkin. We can add a shrink wrap modifier and set it to project and target our pumpkin base mesh that we've put in our hidden collection. And that means that our plane is now sitting on the surface of the pumpkin based on the kind of y-axis. If we give this mesh a solidifying modifier and then go back to the pumpkin mesh and add a boolean set to difference, we can cut that cube out of the pumpkin, and you'll see we're starting to get the right kind of effect here. You're probably going to get weird shading around the cutout, so in the mesh data tab, set auto smooth to on, and that should clean everything up. If we then jump into edit mode for this cutout mesh, we can basically create anything we want. In this case, a spooky pumpkin face, or jack-o'-lantern if you're from America, which based on my demographics you almost certainly are. To light the inside of the pumpkin, we're going to add a little sphere with an emission shader and turn the world lighting all the way down. We can give the pumpkin a little orange material and a bit of subsurface scattering, and then just some noise plugged into the bump map, just to give it a little bit of texture. For the pumpkin mask, we're going to give that holdout shader, which means that it's just going to default to transparent to whatever the background is. And we can hide that cutout mesh completely. You can add some gunk inside the pumpkin with a plane with a cloudy displacement modifier, and use some bezier curves with a bit of thickness to create some sort of stringy things hanging down. It's really up to you how far you go with this and how much texture you want on the inside of your pumpkin. We can make a candle just with a cylinder with a bit of subsurface scattering on, and we can model a little flame with an emission shader plugged into the volume slot. So to make the flame actually look like it's dancing around a bit, we can add a displacement modifier with the clouds texture and then set the coordinates to object and target that to an empty. And then we can just animate that empty moving up throughout the shot to make the flame dance around, and add a vertex group with a displacement modifier to control how much that modifier is affecting the flame at different points. So you can use that to make it look like the bottom of the flame is kind of sticking in place and the top is waving around a lot more. Similarly, we can add a keyframe to the ball we're using as our lighting, and add a noise modifier to the scale transforms in the F-curve editor. And by adjusting the strength and size of that, you can make it look like the light on the inside is flickering. To animate the carving, we're just going to add a shape key, tab into edit mode, adjust the face, and then set keyframes at the start and end of the animation to blend between them. Finally, we've got to remove those pesky tracking markers someone put their ages back. So we'll pick a frame, open it up in Photoshop, and just use content-aware fill to get rid of all the little crosses. We can then hide the base layer and save that as a new file, so we've just got the patches against a transparent background. If we duplicate that base pumpkin mesh again in Blender, we can move to the frame that we opened in Photoshop, tab into edit mode, and UV unwrap it using the project from view setting. Then we can pull the Photoshop file into Blender, hook it up to an emission shader, and use the alpha channel to blend with the transparent shader and put it on its own view layer. In the case of my shot, there was a little reflection on the table, and basically that was just a plane set to be 100% metallic and with a little bit of roughness, which again I put on its own layer. So in the compositor now, we're going to bring in our movie clip and scale it to the size of our render, and then use an alpha over node to place our patches layer on top to remove the tracking markers. We can then use a mix node set to screen to add our reflection in, another alpha over to add our pumpkin, And then we're going to add a bit of glare and lens distortion just to tie everything together a bit better. I'm using Blender 2.81 beta, which means I can use the new denoising feature to render at much lower samples than I would have had to previously. You can add a bit of contrast by using the color management tools in Blender. Usually stick with Filmic, but you can boost the contrast up to either high or very high contrast to just add a little bit more richness to the image. Although in my case, I exported in Filmic log and then I color corrected in Premiere Pro. And there we go. Obviously I put a fair bit more time into the version that you saw at the beginning than the one I've recorded for this tutorial. The geometry I used for the Boolean operation was a little bit too high, and I spent a lot of time trying to troubleshoot little kind of glitches where bits of geometry would overlap and you'd end up with a whole Boolean operation just shutting down. So I'm pretty pleased with how this turned out. I think the depth of field really helps to tie everything together. Obviously it'd probably be a lot easier to just carve a real pumpkin, but I mean, we can put whatever we want on here now and even move it about and animate it, so I guess that's kind of neat. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I hope you found that at least slightly useful. Take care, keep rendering, and I'll see you next week.